I learned about Jesus the God in my early childhood in India. I lived in a big house in Calcutta for my first 9 years. It was a very British life, and Christianity was part of it. I was brought up to accept the story of God living among us, dying for us because he cared for us so much, and going back to heaven with the promise that we could go there too. The reason Jesus is so durable is that Christians have believed this story, that he was divine. This was a once-only appearance, and of course made Jesus unique. As I begin my travels to explore what is lasting about Jesus and his story, I've been remembering the baggage I carried as a child. I was told that the religion of most Indians, Hinduism, with its idols of different gods, was anathema. After all, idolatry was against the 10 Commandments. Islam was a little better. At least Muslims only believed in one God. I never doubted that there was only one true God, and that was Jesus. The India I was brought up in was the India of empire. The Christianity the British brought here was the Church Triumphant, linked to what we thought was our imperial mission to civilize India. This is Calcutta Cathedral, where my parents were married. To me, it epitomizes the Victorian missionary sense of the superiority of Western Christianity. It's built like a Western church. There's hardly any trace of India in the architecture. And it was built to house one of Britain's most energetic missionaries, Bishop Heber of Calcutta. Bishop Heber was a man of great learning and courage. No one should underestimate the devotion and sacrifices of the missionaries. But because he was so convinced of the uniqueness of Jesus, he found it very difficult to discover any good in other religions, as we know from his own hymns. The heathen in his blindness, he wrote, bows down to wood and stone.
Give thanks to God for the Church of Jesus Christ. You have built us up, O God, into the temple of worship. Give us Holy Spirit to know there is no other foundation for us than Jesus Christ, Rock the Redeemer.
I still enjoy singing hymns and go to church quite often. I love the church, but I can't pretend my life has followed a Christian path. I certainly no longer share the triumphant conviction which inspired the missionary efforts in this country, and which I was not surprised to discover in the founding prayer of this cathedral. Let it be a place increasing more and more until this land of darkness be illuminated in all its recesses with the light of the everlasting gospel. Although the Christian assumption of superiority remains, the late 20th century is a world of many faiths living side by side. How then can Christians today interpret the uniqueness of Jesus, which is affirmed so strongly in St. John's Gospel?
Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me.
Ironically, it was India, when I came back as an adult, which undermined my certainty. I could no longer look on Hinduism as mere idolatry, and I came to realize that it's possible for religions to learn from each other rather than compete. Christianity has always been competitive because it claims there has only been one incarnation of God, Jesus. In India, it's believed there have been many incarnations, and they continue to this day. I'm going to see a man whose followers believe he's a living God, the claim that was made for Jesus. The living God here is Sai Baba, whose followers come from all over the world to his center near Bangalore. Isn't it odd? There aren't just souvenirs of one god, Sai Baba, on sale. Here you can buy a picture of Ganesh, the elephant god, or Vishnu, and Jesus too. In my life as a journalist, I tended to scoff at India's godmen. But I should perhaps remember the skeptics scoffed at Jesus too, and accused him of being nothing more than a charlatan. Yet here am I, making this program about him 2,000 years later. Today, thousands of Sai Baba followers will see their living God appearing before them. I want to understand how a human being can be worshipped as a god. Perhaps this will help me find out why it happened to Jesus. How did he become God? I mean, was he born God or?
Yeah. You see, if his mother was once asked by someone, and she said that when she went near a well, a great light entered her, and after that she became pregnant, and then Swami was born. So it is, his birth is called a pravesha or entry, not
an entry by God,
not a birth. Something like that.
So it was a divine...
it was a divine...
almost like Mary's...
origin, divine origin.
The same as Mary's virgin birth, in a way.
Yeah, something like that.
The same as Jesus' virgin birth, same sort of thing.
It's an authentic account given by his mother.
There's a similar magic in Krishna's birth for Hindus, and there are many parallels in the story itself in terms of the birth of a divine child in the middle of the night, accompanied by extraordinary signs. In the Christmas story we have the three kings coming, we have the angels singing. Similarly, with Krishna, suddenly the ocean is agitated, the air is agitated, the heavenly drums are playing, flowers are raining down from the sky. It's an extraordinary birth of the cosmic God, the cosmic Vishnu, in the form of a small human babe.
Ursula King is a professor of comparative religion who studied in India.
In the Christian story you have the tyrant Herod, who fears that his rule will come to an end through the birth of this child. And in Krishna's story you have the tyrant Kamsa, who again, you have the same prophecy. There are basic religious themes here which are expressed through legends and stories, so that wherever you have an extraordinary human being in a particular religion or in a particular culture, you get these legends accruing around the person. People tell the stories, it's embedded in narrative, it's embellished, it is handed down from one generation to another. The stories came into being as a sort of natural organic growth.
What does that say then about the Christian claim that Jesus is the exclusive way, the one way to God?
The theological claim about Christ is really going beyond the stories and giving them a particular meaning and interpretation. I mean, too much on a sort of factual event basis, which I don't think is helpful from a religious point of view, because what you lose is a lot of the substance and the mystery. You know, you could talk about not the universal significance of Christ is so much as universal mystery, but the mystery of God for the Hindu comes across in all the stories about Krishna. Now, the mystery of God, we have lost a lot of that in the West.
I was taught that it was the miraculous stories which made Jesus unique, but they turn out to be what he has in common with other gods. Sai Baba is still alive, and yet his story is already shrouded in myth. We simply don't know very much about the facts of Sai Baba's childhood. If it's difficult to know what happened to him, imagine how much harder it is to discover anything about Jesus' early years.
But there are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself would not contain the books that would be written.
Legends abound about Jesus' so-called missing years, his childhood to the age of 30, when, as St. Luke says, he began his work. According to one legend, he came to India and discussed theology with Brahmin priests. He was in Japan. And of course, there's Glastonbury. There's a story that Jesus came here as a child with Joseph of Arimathea.
The story of Jesus coming here is a mysterious thing. What you'll hear nowadays is that Joseph was his uncle, or presumably his great-uncle, and that when he was a boy, he came here on trading expeditions.
The Glastonbury legend has been studied by Geoffrey Ash.
We know that Joseph was rich. Some people think that it was Cornish tin or some kind of British product, and that Jesus was here during the last years. The story is localised at Glastonbury. It's also localised at Priddy, which is a village up on the Mendip Hills to the north. Now, it's a strange story. There is no trace of this in the Middle Ages. If there had been, you can imagine what the monks of Glastonbury would have made of it, but they never mention it. I don't know when it starts. It's possible that William Blake refers to it, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, but it doesn't seem to become at all popular until the last century or two, and nobody quite knows where it comes from.
It's all too easy to fall into the trap of believing that legend means lie. And then there's the temptation to think that the Gospels were made up to suit the Church's version of Jesus. Now, I know that's an exaggeration. But then, as a journalist, I was taught to respect facts. And as a child, I learnt the phrase, the gospel truth. So where do we draw the line? How much of the gospel has to survive the scrutiny of historians for the Christian story to retain its credibility? The four Gospels have been studied by believers and by skeptics, and no one would deny that there is history in them. The theologian Richard Burridge has used computers to analyze other ancient lives and find out how history was written then compared with now.
If we look at a contemporary biography of our generation, you expect to find a large part about the person's childhood and education, an equal space given to every period of their life, and explaining the psychological motivation behind everything they did. And the Gospels don't look like that. They don't tell us what Jesus looked like. They don't tell us where he went to school. They don't tell us what happened in the first 30 years of his life. They concentrate on this very small period. And as these computer graphs show, they have a great stress upon the death the last couple of days. And so people said, oh, they're not really biographies because they don't look like a modern biography. But if you look at an ancient biography, we find exactly the same pattern. Here's Mark's Gospel. We see that actually a quarter of the verbs in Mark's Gospel have Jesus as the subject. A further fifth are his words and his teaching. And if we compare that with Satyrus's Life of Euripides, we find exactly the same distribution going on. So this shows quite clearly that the Gospels are a form of ancient biography, and that their subject is the person of Jesus.
So, Richard, if I want to know whether Jesus actually said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," can you tell me?
Well, in that particular saying, you've gone for a saying of Jesus from John's Gospel, which doesn't occur in any of the other Gospels. Then we have to relate the Gospels to first century biographies. So, I mean, with all these wonderful books here, if we take Tacitus's life of his father-in-law Agricola, again, as we saw just now, he devotes a quarter of the life of his father-in-law to this one day, one battle in 84 between the Roman troops and the Scottish tribes. And yet all of this material here about the battle is actually a speech given by the native chieftain. It doesn't tell us any of the facts, the 20th century. It doesn't tell us what day it was, where this mountain was, what the strategy was. Instead we get this long speech explaining what's really going on. So the ancients are not interested in did somebody say those very words, but who is this person? What does he stand for? So when Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," in those many words, he could have used those words, but this is only a selection of what's going on, and that phrase stands for the totality of John's understanding of who Jesus is through the Gospel.
I find it reassuring that there are scholars who believe the Gospel story is reliable. But the existence of 4 Gospels shows that bare facts are not enough. It's the interpretations which make the story of Jesus so compelling. The Jesus of history has produced the many Jesuses of faith, and it is they who have inspired so many different people in so many different ways. The strength of his story is the poetry, the art, the legends that it still inspires. India has taught me that.
Whatever these legends represent in the way of historical truth, the important thing for me anyway is that the Jesus of history is also somehow related to the cultural and historical reality of India. And when I have represented Jesus as an Indian, it's been more from the angle that he is relevant to India, that Indians can find in him somebody who can speak to them.
Jyoti Sai is one of India's most renowned Christian artists and also a Catholic theologian.
Sri Ramakrishna had a vision of a man coming towards him dressed in orange saffron clothes, but looking different somehow. And Ramakrishna asked him, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am the Jesus whom you worship." So I think that certainly in modern times, a number of Indian thinkers have felt that Jesus has come to India, if not in the physical sense, at least in a spiritual sense.
India is a great country for myths, and so much of Indian religion is based entirely on myths. How has that affected your Christianity?
Yes, I think that formally there was always a distinction that Christianity is a historical religion and other religions are mythic and symbolic and therefore perhaps not really true. But I think also that in our present understanding of the Bible and our analysis of the Bible, we realize that there is a lot in the Bible which is also myth to be found there. Stories which have come from other societies, and like the story of Noah, which was a myth and which has been incorporated into the Bible. and later on various events which have mythic basis, such as, for example, Jesus walking on the waters, or and so on, which is a common mythic pattern of thinking. And so interwoven in what we call history, there is a great deal of myth. And I think that in my own understanding of Jesus, there is this historical Jesus, but also Jesus as he narrates himself through his own parables, as he tells his own story.
The stories Jesus told in his life inspired the belief that he was God incarnate. 2,000 years later, the hunger for a living God remains. I'm queuing to see someone who is clearly human, yet believed by the thousands here to be a god. But even a god can't guarantee his own security. We must all be screened. There is an element of showmanship here. Plenty of time is left for the tension to build up. Was there this anticipation as the crowds waited in Galilee for Jesus to appear? It would be easy to dismiss this as a spiritual con trick, but Sai Baba's followers are quite ordinary people, not freaks, and he seems to awaken in them a recognition of their own closeness to God.
Doctor, can you tell me, do you believe that Sai Baba is God?
Yes.
It's something that happens inside when truth is seen.
He can do so many things which are beyond human control.
It's something that's there already, but all of a sudden it's awakened.
He's the one that has shown me the light. I've enjoyed his divine nectar, and he's given me the peace that I'm looking for, and he's told me to look within, and he's installed in me.
It's not that he is God alone. He's teaching us that we all are God. That means that we all are the divinity that is embodied in this body, in your body, in his body.
Then you see him in the white light. And then was for myself the moment that he was God. I saw a white light. Baba was very, how's it in English? The cosmos, the universe.
He was the universe.
He was the universe. And myself was a part.
He said some words to me. Within 2 seconds I said, "Yes, Swami," and tears came out of my eyes, and it was my inner voice, it was not me.
He's awakened in me the truth and the love. The love is the most incredible thing about him. It's just like all of a sudden you're alive.
Do you believe that Sai Baba is God in the same way as Jesus was God?
Yes.
If people here and now can believe in the divinity of Sai Baba, then perhaps we should be less skeptical about the idea that people saw God in Jesus during his lifetime. Sai Baba recognized that he was special when he was 13, Jesus when he was 12, apparently.
And when he was 12 years old, they found him in the temple, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And he said to them, "How is it that you sought me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?"
That story of Jesus in the temple, indicating that he did think he was specially close to God, is only in Luke's Gospel. The other three Gospels don't mention the incident, but all the Gospels raise the question of Jesus' relationship with God.
When Jesus died, did he think he was God?
I think if we say, did he think he was God, that at once throws our culture off in the wrong direction, because we use the word God to mean this being who's miles up in the sky somewhere.
Tom Wright is a New Testament scholar and Anglican priest.
But for the Jews, there was the one true and living God who was intimately present with his people, as well as being utterly transcendent. And the Bible is full of, the Jews' Bible that Jesus knew as the Bible, is full of pictures of this God coming back to his people, both to judge all that is wrong in their society and to rescue them at the deepest level. And it looks to me as though, as Jesus went up to Jerusalem and did those extraordinary things, he was acting as though he believed he was the temple's replacement, that is, the place where God lived, and also as though he was embodying that whole theme of Israel's God returning to his people at last. I believe this was something he was aware of as a matter of vocation, that he had to do and be what, according to his Bible, only God does and is. And that was an extraordinary, scary vocation. He knew he might be blaspheming and that it would cost him his life, and it did.
Of a Gothic cathedral, they draw you upwards, they pull your mind upwards. It's a bit like this very splendid temple here in South India. You have the towers there soaring up to the sky, pointing to the heavens. It's really this pointing to transcendence. You go more and more into the center, and the Holy of Holies, the sacred space, is really most powerfully at the very center, and that is, comparatively speaking, very small. It's really as if the whole universe were organized and arranged around God, around Brahma.
I was brought up to love Christian imagery, and it came as a shock when I first learned that there are similarities between churches and Hindu temples, both in their architecture and in the beliefs that inspired them. But the difference for me is all the diversity I see in this temple. No services, no straight pews, no narrow aisles, everyone doing their own thing.
I think there are many parallels in our Christian attitude to God and the Hindu attitude to God between, let's say, the presence of God in the Eucharist the communion. And there's certainly lots of parallels in terms of the function of the temple and the church and the nature of worship and prayer. And what is perhaps stronger in Hinduism is meditation, more than we have in the Christian church. But I think in terms of Jesus the teacher, Jesus the wise person, Jesus who is the healer, Jesus who is the friend, Jesus who is the person who feeds people, that's very strong in the Hindu tradition. And I mean, there are certain aspects in the stories about the gods that bring this also out, that God feeds us, that God heals us, that God protects us. There's not just one way of talking about God. There's not just one way of worshipping God. There are many different ways, but they all point to the one, to that which is hidden and unmanifest, which expresses itself in these myriad of forms. And in a way, the temple is a kind of living embodiment and expression of this. The many pillars, the towers, the courtyards, the shrines. There are always many shrines in the temple, apart from the central one. The many people in different acts of worship. You know, there is this room for diversity and pluralism in the way that we don't have it in the West.
I believe that all gods, all religions are one. It's the form that you want to believe in.
All the different forms of God, it's all the same to me.
I've believed in Krishna, Shiva, and Jesus Christ, and everybody, but Baba has shown me the light through his form.
What Jesus or the others did for me is that they all believe they had the only truth. Yeah, and Sai Baba had never said that I have the truth, because he wants to unite all the religions.
Sai Baba's symbol, which incorporates emblems of different religions, expresses the diversity of his faith. What he is saying is that all roads lead to God.
Actually, large number of people who have come here who are Christians have understood Christianity and Jesus Christ better through the teachings of Swami.
The first state is you are messenger of God. You realize that you are divine. The second state is you becoming son of God. And the third is you realize that you are God. And Jesus was realizing in the end of his life, I'm sure that he is one with the Father.
I wouldn't really compare him with Jesus.
But would you say he was as much God as Jesus was God?
I think we're all as much God as Jesus was God. You are as much God as Jesus was, and so am I.
So what is the difference between us and Jesus or Swami?
Well, that they know it, and we don't.
Christianity is a religion which excludes all other religions. It claims the Christian way is the only way. But in India, there are religions which accept that there can be many different ways to God. That Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims are all traveling to the same destination. They've only chosen different routes.
There are Christians who believe that India can teach Christianity to go beyond the intolerance that comes from the colonial past. Shantivanam is the home of that Indian Christian movement. Father Christodas is a Benedictine monk who runs this ashram.
Christodas, why do you have all these Hindu rituals in the service which you have in chapel? And why do you dress more like a Hindu than a Christian monk?
See, since I am an Indian and a Christian, I don't want to get out of my Indian identity as an Indian and the Christian life doesn't exclude me from practicing my rich Indian heritage. Midday, we are having this Arati. Arati means take the light in front of this tabernacle and we see the light of Christ through that. So 3 times we take the Arati in front of the Blessed Sacrament and then we receive the light by bowing like this with both hands, receive the light of Christ. Then we put midday a red mark, evening ash. Our midday meaning is this: after receiving the light of Christ, we are remembered or reminded of the inner eye of the Holy Spirit or inner eye of Brahman according to India. But for me is the wisdom of God, and for me wisdom is the Holy Spirit.
But you would agree that you can reach God without Jesus through Hinduism, for example?
No. Each religion is a unique revelation of the same God, same Christ. And Christ is a man among men, but at the same time, he is the unique manifestation of the same Father, not only for Christians, he is a universal God.
Discovering how much two such different religions as Christianity and Hinduism have in common says something to me about the miracle of God. It seems to mean that we're all seeking the same God, whatever our creed, culture, or color. But when Hinduism and Christianity come as close to each other as they do here at Shantivan, there must be a danger of the humanity of Jesus disappearing altogether in a concentration on the divine. For those who seek the Christian way to God, the human Jesus has to be as important as the divine Jesus. Leaving Shantivanam, a funeral procession reminded me that all the questions raised by Jesus relate to the universal mysteries of suffering and death.
Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
Most of India's Christians suffer, coming as they do from the poorest section of society. They are the Dalits, or former untouchables, who were converted by missionaries, but are still at the very bottom of the social pile.
They still suffer the stigma of untouchability, still suffer the discrimination which has made them live in segregated villages, worse than apartheid. And the people from the Dalit village even today go 30 miles away from Madras, go quite close to this village here. You will find they cannot wear slippers and walk through the caste village. They cannot go ride on a cycle. They cannot be recognized as human beings.
Bishop Azara is the first Dalit Bishop of Madras and a champion of their cause.
You know, many stories are repeated. Child, school child, a Dalit girl rides a cycle and goes, immediately some people come and stop her and rape her. This is the kind of thing goes on. People think they are cheap and they treat them as if they are nobodies. Now this goes on in the village. That's a kind of a suffering that goes on. And many more things can be said.
I am Dalit. I am close, very near to Jesus.
Do you think Jesus is a Dalit?
Yes, of course, he is a Dalit. That's why I am very happy.
He is God who came down to earth to work for the oppressed of the society. So today I see him as a model for me.
கடவுள் மூலியமா அந்த நாட்டுல இருந்து இந்த நாட்டு பாருங்க வர அவங்க மூலியமா அவர்
வந்து ஏழைகளின் கடவுள் அப்படினு சொல்லி நீங்க நம்புறீங்களா?
நம்புறேன்.
She believes that Jesus is the God of the poor, and also through him only we all have come here, it seems.
He died
to save you and your community, the Dalits.
If you ask the village people, they will witness to the fact that they have an inner joy. In spite of the circumstances, they have learned to cope with life, with certain hope about life beyond. Not only life beyond, life that comes upon this earth. The beyond, the heaven comes on this earth. The kingdom of God comes upon earth. This kind of an understanding gives them inner joy.
Did the Dalits accept Christianity because they thought it would remove their social stigma, give them self-respect? Were they attracted by the offer of education or the hope of jobs? Did they believe that Jesus was superior because they saw him as a Western God? Or was it because as a God who suffered, they believed he sympathized with them and that they sympathized with him as well? I watched the Dalits following the way of the cross on Good Friday, and I could see how, for poor and outcast people, it's the human sufferings of Jesus which really speak to them. Perhaps these people, whose actual lives are miles away from the values and indeed the wealth of Western culture, are nearer to Jesus than we can ever be.
This idea of an ordinary son of a carpenter representing God or manifesting God is, I think, quite a unique idea. That is to say that the experience of very ordinary people reveals something which shows the divine. So that is one aspect of Christ which I think is very significant. The other one is his attitude towards suffering. The question of suffering is present in most philosophical systems, but it was always from the point of view of how to avoid it. But I think that one could say that the essence of Jesus's gospel was that suffering could be something very positive, that it was part of the creative process. And I think that this is what has interested many artists about the gospel tradition, that he related it very much with the experience of a woman about to give birth, a kind of travail, where he said in his last discourses, in the same way as a mother feels great pain but then feels joy after the baby is born, so suffering is only, as it were, part of the journey towards a greater experience of joy. Many people in the West think that their culture is Christian culture, and that's the only possible Christian culture. Whereas the culture of the West probably has nothing particularly Christian about it. So that so it came to India. The missionaries came to India with an assumption that the culture of Christianity in India would have to be just a copy of the kind of culture which was in the West. So what we are trying to perhaps discover in the church in India is a culture which is not based just on Western standards, but which arises out of our own experience.
At last, I do seem to have found a difference between Jesus the God and the gods of India. Sai Baba is human, but he almost seems to live above the ground, insulated from us ordinary mortals. The gods of Hindu mythology, we don't know whether they ever lived at all. What perhaps makes Jesus unique is that he is one God who has to have lived a very full life with his feet firmly planted on the ground, if Christianity's claim that he shared our sufferings and died for us is to be justified.
The life of Jesus inspires in us the belief that there is a God who cares for us, who can accompany us on our life's journey. But nowadays, we in the West are reluctant to believe anything that we cannot prove. That means that whether I like it or not, I have to examine what the historians say about the facts of Jesus' life and see where they leave the myth. I can't forget that the claims of Christianity are based on the life of a man who really lived 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years after his birth, Jesus still commands our attention because millions of people believe he was God. So far, I've examined the divine Jesus. But he was a historical figure, a man from a particular race, a Jew. History has always been important for Christianity because it rests its claims on real people and real events. So, what can history teach us about the life of Jesus? To find the Jewish Jesus, I must go to Israel, where he lived. He never left his native land or abandoned his religion. The Jews were unique in the ancient world, believing their God was the only God. Christians and Jews have forgotten that Jesus was born into this unique race. Isn't that curious? Jerusalem, a sacred place for Christians because it's where the life of Jesus ended. In fact, it's really a Muslim and Jewish city. It's here, in this ethnic melting pot, that I must try to shed my white Christian image of Jesus. Though I've always known that Jesus was Jewish, I'm sure that I've never really taken that on board. The Jesus I see around me is a Western import, but here I sense that's misleading, untrue to history. I wonder what I'm missing by not thinking of him as a Jew.
focus of the city for Jews is the site of their ancient temple. A bare wall built of its ruins is all that remains. This is the Western Wall, the most sacred place in Jewish life. Jews still come from all over the world to pray and celebrate bar mitzvahs, when a Jewish boy becomes a man. In Jesus' time, the Jews had only one temple, the focus of their fierce loyalty to the one God. They believed they should be free to live their lives under God's rule. But in the first century, the Romans ruled the Jews. Jesus grew up in a world of deep resentment. The Roman presence seemed to show that the God who had freed them from bondage to the Egyptians had abandoned them and was now absent even from his temple. The Jews' response to the crisis was confused and divided. There were some who wanted to fight for the temple. There were some who thought almost any compromise was worth it to save the temple. And there were some who rejected the temple outright and withdrew to the desert to wait for God's last battle. In the scriptures, there were prophecies that God would return to his temple to drive out the enemy and establish his kingdom. Everywhere, there was a sense that the apocalypse was just round the corner.
Behold, I send my messenger to prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple.
The day of darkness, and the sun shall be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood.
I will take my stand to watch, and station myself in the tower, and look forth to see what he will say to me.
All who call upon the name of the Lord shall be delivered.
Into this turbulent world, where everyone expected something to happen, but no one could agree what, Jesus was born. Times were so confused that it's very difficult to discover the exact role Jesus played. I realize, of course, that the Gospels claim to know who he was from the moment of his birth, but historical evidence doesn't necessarily support their story.
We know that Bethlehem first mentioned in the Bible in the book of Genesis, where we know that Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, buries his wife Rachel on the road to Ephrathah, which is Bethlehem. And subsequent to that, the Old Testament prophet Micah prophesies that a king of all Israel will come out of Bethlehem.
And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the city of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to be delivered. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn.
So the narrative, which refers to the house of David and ties it in with Bethlehem, requires that the family of Jesus come down from the north, from Nazareth, and come here to the town of Bethlehem to establish this as Jesus' birthplace. The reason given by Luke relates to a census for the purpose of paying taxes. The problem is, of course, historians have gone back to check the census records in Rome, and in this case they've come up empty. We don't have records of a census which was conducted by Rome anywhere in this part of the world at the time of Jesus.
So, on my first stop, I'm faced with doubts about the gospel story. As a journalist, I need to be cautious about Bethlehem. But actually, I don't want to be. I'd like to hold on to the traditional Christian belief I learnt as a child, that through a stable door is the birthplace of Jesus. The Church of the Nativity.
A small church over the place of the birth of Jesus. Then it was extended.
I'm sure the pilgrims who come here are looking for the Christ child at Christmas, not for a Jewish baby. Down in the crypt, where a star marks the traditional birthplace, I find myself wondering, could this be where God was born? It's so un-Jewish, the prostrations, the oil lamps. It's more like Hindus worshipping the baby Krishna. Jews have always been critical of any kind of idolatry. As a Jew, Jesus would have abhorred images of God. His God was invisible. Even his name was too holy to be spoken.
We'll be coming up on Nazareth now. Nazareth, the place where Jesus spent almost the entirety of his life.
And they returned into Galilee to their own city, Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom. And the favor of God was upon him.
Luke's Gospel describes Jesus' upbringing as a Jewish boy, the son of Mary. But now Christianity has captured the child Jesus, locating this pastiche of his home inside the huge church of the Annunciation. The Jewish child has disappeared under the weight of Christian piety, almost as though the church doesn't want us to see him as a Jew. The cloisters are adorned with mosaics. Every corner of the Christian world has taken Jesus and his mother Mary for itself.
Over there, for instance, there's one from Poland. Here's a Madonna from Catalonia, and this one, I think, must come from China. These Madonnas come from all around the world, but there's one exception. When I asked the caretaker whether there was a Jewish Madonna here, he said, "We gave you the original Mary. Isn't that good enough?"
This is the whole problem, peeling off the layers the church has painted over the Jewish Jesus. That's very difficult because the main sources we have are the Gospels, and they're profoundly Christian.
What sort of place was Nazareth, Jay?
Nazareth was a small little village, maybe about 200 families.
Was it an important place in Judaism?
Oh no, to the best of my knowledge, it's never mentioned.
Scholars like Jerome Murphy O'Connor believe that we can be certain of some basic facts about the Jewish Jesus.
St. John was pretty rude about it, wasn't he?
Yes, I mean, what good could come out of Nazareth? And it was one of the arguments against the importance of Jesus that he was from a place which had no locus in Jewish history.
Father Jerry helped me to see that the Gospels are most historically accurate when they relate incidents which don't help the church make its case that Jesus was the Messiah. That's why we're on solid ground with Nazareth. We can also be fairly certain that Jesus came under the influence of a preacher who was baptizing people to wash away their sins, to prepare them for the day when God would intervene. This was John the Baptist.
In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens opened and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "Thou art my beloved Son, with thee I am well pleased."
The fact of the baptism, I think, is absolutely certain, precisely because it was such an embarrassment to the early church. There were people in the 2nd century who thought that John was the Messiah. Why? Because it was Jesus who came to him, and in this part of the world, the Middle East, it is the inferior who goes to the superior. And what John was offering was a baptism for the remission of sins. So people did say that Jesus must have been conscious of sin, therefore he couldn't have been the Messiah.
Well, what was the relationship between Jesus and John then?
At the beginning, it was a relationship of dependency, that John took Jesus as his assistant, and we know that when the two of them crossed the river, they divided their forces. Jesus and his disciples baptized in Judea, while John, the leader, took the more difficult task and baptized among the Samaritans. And that's why I think it's important to recognize that when Jesus came to Galilee for the first time to preach and was recognized, our people thought he was John the Baptist all over again, it must have been because he was doing the same sort of thing that John had been doing, namely baptizing for the remission of sins. Subsequently, Jesus realizes he has the power to work miracles.
So in a way, Jesus grows out of his mission with John. He grows bigger than John.
Exactly. And John then, from prison, sends to ask the question, are you he who is to come, or do we look for another? John was totally astonished that the Jesus who appeared matured in Galilee was not the Jesus whom he had known and commissioned to preach in Judea.
Jesus came from Galilee, preaching the gospel of God and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons.
It was only after John that Jesus appeared himself in Galilee, announcing the kingdom of God. It seems strange to me that Jesus changed his role from prophet to miracle worker, that he didn't know his destiny from the beginning. Yet, as soon as I grasp something about Jesus as a first-century Jew, I get swept back to the Christ of Christian Europe.
On the northern shores of the Sea of Galilee, this is the place most frequently mentioned in the New Testament in connection with Jesus' prophecies, his ministry, his miracles, his teaching. The northern shores of the Sea of Galilee, where we have a number of churches of great importance. The church at Tabcha, commemorating the primacy of Peter, where Jesus, after the resurrection, comes, sees some of his disciples.
This church is built, I'm told, on the site where the risen Christ of John's Gospel commissioned Peter to feed his sheep after a miraculous catch of fish. In Jewish tradition, there's nothing particularly strange about miracles. They were a sign that the miracle worker was God's agent. Another ride, another stop, another church on top of another miracle. This time, the loaves and fishes.
They began, the 12 disciples began to break it, and they began to break it. The more they broke it, the more there was to break. That is the miracle.
It's such a small area that you can visit all the major sites within a morning. It's almost a Christian theme park.
The multiplication of bread is run by the Benedictines. Capernaum is run by the Franciscan. Primacy of St. Peter here is run by the Franciscans. And then the top one, the Sermon of the Mount, is run by the Franciscan sisters. You're most welcome.
And now the Mount of the Beatitudes, where, according to tradition, the best-known sermon in the world was preached. We've seen that Jesus was a miracle worker, but he was also a great teacher. He drew on the Jewish conviction that nature was God's creation and to be admired, not feared as many did in those days. I know I'm an incurable romantic, but what matters to me is not what happened on which site, but that he walked these hills and the shores of this lake. I'm sure that Jesus too was moved by the beauty of Galilee. Otherwise, why did he tell people to consider the lilies of the field and the birds of the air? The lake was his cathedral and his pulpit was a boat.
And passing along by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw Simon
And he
Andrew,
saw
the
two
brother of
boats
Simon,
by the lake,
casting a
but
net
the
in the sea,
fishermen
the
did
brother
not
of
know
Simon,
that it was Jesus.
casting a net in the sea.
Jesus said to them, "Children,
We toiled all night
Jesus
and
saw
took nothing.
Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net in the sea, for they were fishermen.
The Gospels describe accurately the skill of the fishermen who became Jesus' disciples.
שמי מנדל נון, אני גר על הים כבר מעל ל-50 שנה, אבל אני עבדתי בדייג שנת 40 עד שנת 60, והיו הרבה מושלים בכנרת, ועבדנו אז בדיוק בתמרשתות, כפי שעבדו אז בזמנו של ישו.
For the wind was against them, and about the fourth watch of the night he came to them.
you will find some."
And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for it."
בברית החדשה, בסינופטים, אתה מוצא דוחים מקצועיים של הדייג, אבל אתה מוצא קטעים אותנטיים של עבודת הדייגים בזמן הזה.
And now they were not able to haul it in for the quantity of fish.
And as their nets were breaking, they beckoned to their
And although there were so many, the net was not torn.
הדייגים היו בים, עבדו כל הלילה, ולא תפסו שום דבר, ובבוקר כבר התחילו לקפל ולרחוץ את הרשתות. והוא ראה את הסקול, את הנחיל של הדגים, ואמר להם איפה לזרוק. וזה מקובל עד היום הזה, אגב.
We can take it from the Gospels that Jesus, like other Jewish teachers, attracted a hard core of dedicated followers. We can also assume he was credited with miracles and taught. But I'm still not clear where he stood in the fractured world of first-century Judaism. Capernaum, Jesus' base by the Sea of Galilee. What a monstrosity. This church has buried the supposed foundations of Peter's house in what looks like an underground car park. But here, even Christians can't ignore the Jewish Jesus. There's a synagogue on the site. It's later than Jesus, but it could well stand on the site where he preached and where the gospel writers tell us he aroused controversy.
And they came to Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, and not as the scribes.
At last, I met someone who sees where Jesus might fit within Judaism. David Rosen, a rabbinic scholar.
How do you see Jesus, basically? And what do you think he was?
He was a Jewish rabbi. He was born as a Jew, lived as a Jew, taught, preached as a Jew, and died as a Jew.
So would you say that the hostility between Jesus and the scribes and Pharisees, the hostility which I was certainly told was so central to the whole gospel story, didn't exist at all?
No, I wouldn't say it didn't exist, but it existed within the context of not only a community, but probably of one particular denomination within Judaism. If you look at the Pharisaic discussions themselves, you'll see the kind of very passionate, often acerbic language that is used when they are discussing a particular subject with each other. In fact, if we take a tractate of the Mishnah, the ethics of the fathers, Rabbi Eliezer, a rabbi, Pharisaic rabbi, speaks of the sages, his contemporaries, and he says, beware of them, because their bite is the bite of a fox, their hiss is a hiss of a viper, of a snake, and their sting is a sting of a scorpion. Well, this is the kind of language of internal debate that took place. And indeed, even if you look at the prophets, when the prophets are criticizing the people for certain misgivings on their part a long, long time before this particular period, they also use very strong language. So this language was the natural language of debate, which did not mean that they considered the others to be outside the pale or to be beyond the bounds of redemption, as it were.
As a rabbi, what was Jesus then teaching when he talked so much about the kingdom of God?
The kingdom of God is one amongst many Jewish ideas that are very central, all Jewish ideas that are central to Jesus' teaching. But this, of course, was part and parcel of the expectation of the people, an ancient expectation that goes back to the words of the prophets themselves, that there would be an independent life here, free of the yoke of the foreign oppressor. In other words, at that context, Rome would no longer oppress Israel, that the people would be free to follow their way of life, that there would be peace amongst the people and amongst all nations of the world. This was the image of the kingdom of God, that a world would be a world that would be a wonderful world for everybody.
And what was Jesus telling people that they should do to achieve that, then?
Exactly what he describes to be the two central teachings, the ultimate teachings, which are the essential teachings of Judaism. When asked, he says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your might and all your soul, Deuteronomy chapter 6. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. He was articulating the fundamental Jewish teachings, which are seen as the key to bringing about the kingdom of heaven on earth.
David, I was brought up to believe that there was a completely different emphasis, that the Jews, the rabbis, I don't know whether modern rabbis call each other vipers or foxes, but if Jesus was a rabbi, clearly he wasn't gentle, meek and mild. He was a man of passionate intelligence, even godly aggression. I'm startled by the thought that Jesus might even have been a kind of Pharisee. I was taught they stood for rigidity, hypocrisy, for everything Jesus opposed. Do we have to scrub the word Pharisaic from our dictionaries? From what I've heard and seen around here, it seems to me that if Jesus had remained on the shores of this lake, he'd have been a nobody. He'd have been forgotten like the other teachers and miracle workers of his time. It was because he went up to Jerusalem that he changed the course of history.
When the days drew near for him to be received up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him, who went to Jerusalem and suffer many things today and tomorrow and the day following. For it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem.
They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid.
Jerusalem,
And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them
and everything that is written of the Son of Man by the prophets.
We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles.
He wept over it.
Jerusalem, 70 miles from the Sea of Galilee. Here, Jesus came to challenge the sacred temple. He seems to have shared the conviction of some Jews that it had become corrupt, an obstacle to God's purpose. What's more, he came at Passover, when religious fervor was at its height. And I've been drawn back to the site of the temple. This is where I met the historian Ed Sanders, a world authority on Jesus and Judaism.
Jews, of course, instead of having a lot of temples to the same God or a lot of temples to different gods, had just one temple to the one God. And it was at the heart of the Jewish religion. The slaughter of animals took place outside. There would be hooks where they would be hung up, throats slipped, and then the animal would be hung up onto a hook to drain, and then there would have to be table, or it would be dismembered. So it's a kind of abattoir with kitchen. And then, of course, at Passover, there was the big slaughter. It's when they killed the 30 or so thousand lambs within just a couple of hour period. The place would have been awash in blood.
What was Jerusalem like at Passover, Ed?
Well, for one thing, there was just an enormous crowd on hand. The ordinary population of Jerusalem was perhaps 25,000 or 30,000. For Passover, it was about 350,000. And then, of course, Passover naturally triggers thoughts of independence. And then just so many people and packed in such small space, and with the theme of Jewish freedom, it was a good time for uprisings. Everyone knew that Passover was a good time for uprisings, and the Romans tried to cut them off by bringing in more troops.
And many spread their garments on the road, and others spread leafy branches which they'd cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed cried out, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the kingdom of our father David that is coming. Hosanna in the highest."
What do you think Jesus was doing on his last visit to the temple?
Well, I think in general, he and his disciples had gone for Passover. They made up one of the bands of Galileans that was making pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover. Now, what did he have in mind for that particular Passover? This is one of the harder questions. Did he know in advance that he was going to take actions and say things that would put his life in jeopardy? I'm not sure. He could have, though. He himself may have seen this Passover as being the time when he was going to make his boldest statement.
And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons.
There's a second and much more powerful statement about the temple that's attributed to him. It is that this temple made with hands will be destroyed, and there would be another one made without hands. And that statement seems to have been enormously influential. So I think that a lot of Jews thought that he posed a threat to the temple.
And when it was evening, he came with the 12. And as they were at table eating, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread in the same dish as me."
Please follow me this way, ladies and gentlemen. Marina, I'm going to ask you to be the guest of honor, as Jesus would have been sitting as the host in the second seat from the left. Marina? In the biblical narrative, John was leaning on the chest of Jesus.
The Last Supper. I've come to share this traditional meal with both Christians and Jews. Jesus shared the Passover meal on the night before he died. For Christians, this has become the sacrament of the Last Supper, Holy Communion.
Leading us to understand from that Jesus seems to have seated...
As the meal progressed, I began to see how Christianity had grown from Judaism and then abandoned it.
I think Jesus was participating in a real Passover meal, and that they were sitting around to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And he knew, and so did the participants know, that that story was their story, and they would be saying, "I was there."
It is obvious, I think, that whether it was the specific occasion or not, the significance of celebrating the redemption from bondage in Egypt and of throwing off the yoke of the oppressor had profound significance for those who were participating in it, as indeed it would have had for all the Jewish people at that time. Passover, in a sense, was an insidious, subversive festival as far as the Romans were concerned.
But Yvette, surely also Jesus made another demonstration just before the Passover that he was looking for liberation of some sort by what he did in the temple, didn't he?
Yes. Yes, he did. I think there was something else. It's inner liberation. By saying to his disciple, drink this is my blood, and eat this is my body, he wanted to deliver them from this bondage of believing to a custom that needed real blood and real flesh to please God.
You would think that Jesus would have wanted them next year not to have observed the Passover?
I think Jesus was very eager to continue the Jewish traditions, but to give it a much more spiritual and deeper meaning.
So you agree that next year he would have asked them to celebrate it, but with a deeper meaning?
Yes.
But Morena, do you think that Jesus could have in any way imagined or thought that those words he said about body and blood could be developed into this enormous sacramental meaning that they've come to have in Christianity?
I don't think Jesus thought that at the Passover meal. I really believe that he was a loyal Jew who was sitting there. And I believe also that I don't think he was trying to spiritualize it. And I think too that if he thought that he was going to die, that part of the Last Supper was a demonstration that death would not be the last word, because the part of what's said of the Last Supper.
And as they were eating, he took bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them and said, "Take, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he'd given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many."
Gethsemane, the Kidron Valley. The scene for the drama of Jesus last night. But we have to be cautious again. Behind the gospel narrative are the somber words of Old Testament prophecy.
Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow.
I have become a stranger to my brethren, an alien to my mother's sons.
I looked for pity,
The zeal
but
for
there
thy
was
house
none,
is consumed.
and for comforters, but I found none. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink.
It's made my flesh and my skin waste away, and broken my bones.
My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
The Kidron Valley is Jerusalem's ancient burial ground, a sacred place for Jews, a place of death and ritual, and the setting for the Passion story.
And that place over there where he stopped, that would have been a natural place to stop and have a rest.
Oh, when I was a smoker, that's where I would have stopped to have had a cigarette before the steep slope that goes up, especially since in the Russian property just behind it, that you have a flight of steps. And of course, going up steps is much more tiring than a path.
And when he stopped there, that was where he said, take this cup from me.
That's where he collapsed, in fact, because Jesus had foreseen his death. I think he had come to terms with it. He had recognized that it was part of God's plan. And so he was expecting it. But nonetheless, when, remember, it was full moon, it was Passover, seeing those big tombs, you see the Pharaoh's bonnet there, that would have been there at the time of Jesus, then it suddenly hit him. It might be tonight. And that's why in a moment of panic, and the language that is used is very strong, it's a person who's breaking down psychically and physically through fear. The personality is disintegrating. And then he collapses on the ground, and it doesn't sound like a prayer to me. If it is possible, he's not even sure that God can help him.
So he's lost God, it says at that stage.
Yes, this is to me a cry of despair.
And they went to a place which was called Gethsemane. And going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible to thee. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what thou wilt.
I'd always wanted to take part in the Stations of the Cross, where pilgrims are led along the Via Dolorosa, the traditional route that Jesus took to his death. For Christian pilgrims, this is where faith and history are so tightly woven that it seems impossible to separate them. But the mystery for me is that the gospel writers went out of their way to blame the Jews for the crucifixion and excuse the Romans.
Pilate protested. What crime has he committed? They only shouted louder, crucify him.
Adoramus te Christe et benedicimus tibi.
Why would Pilate have ordered this execution? What did he see? I mean, he wouldn't have been worried about blasphemy and that sort of thing, would he?
No, he was, of course, worried about upheaval. The peace of Rome was maintained by killing anyone who might threaten it. And the thing that scared everyone in the ancient world was crowd, upheaval, things got out of hand, there's a riot.
The second stage. Seconda stazione. Jesus carries the cross.
Pater noster.
And this would have alarmed the Jewish aristocracy. They would have been afraid of upheaval because if there were upheaval and the Romans drew their swords, and if a legion had to come in from Syria, thousands and thousands of Jews would die. So the Jewish aristocracy and Pilate agreed. Anyone who seemed like he might cause an uprising should be killed.
The third station. Here, Jesus falls the first time. Fourth station. Here, Jesus meets his blessed mother.
Quinta stazione.
The fifth station. As they led him away, they laid hold of one Simon the Cyrenian who was coming in from the field. The sixth station.
Come uno davanti al quale ci si copre la faccia, era disprezzato e non ne aveva.
The seventh station. Here, Jesus falls the second time. The eighth station. Here, Jesus meets the Holy
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris.
What got him killed was what he did and what he said about the temple. When he hung on the cross, people came by and taunted him, saying, "You who will destroy the temple, save yourself."
Miserere nostri Domini.
Here, Jesus dies on the cross. Jesus uttered a loud cry and said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. After he said this, he expired.
It's one of the strangest ironies of history that a crucified Jew could cause centuries of anti-Semitism.
The word anti-Semitism triggers notions of Europe and powerful Gentile governments persecuting little Jewish minorities. And that's completely the wrong picture for the first century, when there was this little tiny Christian bunch. But this little tiny Christian bunch was quite happy to dump blame on Jews.
And it is a great tragedy that due to the historical circumstances which led to the internecine tension and to the not only terrible polemic, but actual physical acts of violence and prejudice acted upon throughout the ages, that the beauty of Jesus' teaching has been lost to a great degree to the Jewish community.
The cry in the Gospel of Matthew, "Be his blood on us and on our children," has been used again and again and again to justify Christian slaughter of Jews, for example. And I'm sure that if Matthew, who wrote those lines, had known their result, he would have not written them. He wouldn't want millions of Jews killed.
The shadow of the cross is between the church and the Jews. Gospel writers exaggerated the role of the Jews in the crucifixion. It was only the temple authorities, a tiny group, who wanted Jesus out of the way. But down the centuries, Christians have blamed the whole Jewish community. Now we all live in the shadow of the Holocaust. It's become common to blame Christianity for preparing the way for Hitler's final solution. Here at Yad Vashem, the memorial to the 6 million who died, I wonder whether any of this would have happened if the church had remembered that its founder was a Jew. "6 million dead. An apocalypse, but one brought about by man, not God." I now understand that Jesus was a man of his times. Perhaps a prophet, a miracle worker, a rabbi, maybe a healer, or even Messiah. Modern skeptics often seem to doubt that he even existed, but he did. He became arguably the most influential man who ever existed. How human he was, too. Perhaps he lost his nerve. He certainly made mistakes. Jesus the Jew believed that God would intervene in history, that he'd establish his kingdom here on earth. He spoke of the end of this present world, of the sun darkening and the moon turning to blood. His attack on the temple was a cue for God to take action. But God didn't act, and Jesus was crushed. Doesn't that mean he got it badly wrong? Though God didn't intervene, Jesus did get one thing right. 40 years after the crucifixion, Roman armies entered Jerusalem and burnt the temple to the ground. But even as it fell, the cult of Jesus was already spreading beyond Jerusalem and Galilee as far as Rome. This leaves me with a huge unanswered question. How did a country rabbi who challenged the power of the temple and was casually killed by a Roman governor come to be worshipped after his death? Is there something more about the earthly life of Jesus, which would explain why Christianity eventually took over the very empire which had tried to crush him? Is there a different story to tell about the Jesus who was the enemy of Rome? A great fire swept through Rome in the year 64, 30 years after Jesus died. There were by then so many Christians in Rome that the Emperor Nero chose them as scapegoats to kill the rumor that he had started the fire. He had thousands of them tortured to death. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote an account of this mass execution. This is almost the only contemporary mention outside the Bible of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for the moment.
Tacitus is certain Jesus died as a criminal. He was sentenced by a Roman official, and it was Roman soldiers who carried out the execution. For those who believe that Jesus was primarily a spiritual teacher and healer, this raises a difficult question. What exactly did Jesus do to offend the most mighty empire the world has ever seen? Rome, the power center of the world in which the early Christian movement expanded so rapidly. The majesty of St. Peter's in Rome speaks of a Jesus ruling the universe, the light of the world shining down from on high. The Jesus of the fledgling church was very different. The early Christians needed a God who was accessible, who knew what they were suffering, almost who suffered with them. They were despised as dangerous, immoral, and seedy. Over the years, the primitive church in Rome buried their dead in an underground network of Christian cemeteries, catacombs. Do you have any idea how many people would have been buried here altogether?
There were probably thousands, because these go on literally all the way around the circumference of the walls of Rome, on all the streets leading out of Rome. There would have been miles of them, literally miles.
As I went deeper underground with my guide, Dominic Crossan, we passed some of the finest examples of early Christian art. Amongst the biblical scenes, there's the Good Shepherd, one of the earliest pictures of Jesus. But why no crucifixion or resurrection?
That's the extraordinary thing, Mark. If you imagine reading all the Christian texts up to the year 200 and then guessing what now will they paint on their catacomb walls and carve on their sarcophagus faces, we would be embarrassingly wrong. We would say, of course, there'll be crucifixion, there'll be resurrection, there'll certainly be Last Judgment. After all, they're being buried.
Yes.
So there should be pictures of the Last Judgment up here. Instead of that, we get pictures of a young, beardless, healing God.
Does this mean that to them, the resurrection, the day of judgment, the crucifixion were not important?
No, I wouldn't want to say that, and I wouldn't want to say there's a complete, as it were, disjunction between the popular piety and the official, you might say, scribal piety that we read in the texts. But if you ask what were on people's mind, they saw God, they saw Jesus as a deliverer from the pain of life's agonies, as it were. And it is very much about life on earth.
The life of Jesus began in the reign of the first Roman Emperor Augustus, who seized supreme power after years of civil war. In Luke's story of the birth of Jesus, it was Augustus who ordered the census that brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. In Palestine, there was widespread resentment against Herod, the half-Jewish king whom the Romans appointed and protected. He wanted to appear a loyal and benevolent Jew. He rebuilt the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in magnificent style and persuaded the Romans to give him the title King of the Jews. But he also had the reputation of a ruthless tyrant, as in Matthew's story of the wise men's quest for a rival King of the Jews, the infant Jesus.
Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, was in a furious rage, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under.
The unrest caused by this political oppression at the time of the birth of Jesus was further fueled by an economic crisis in the countryside.
Socio-economic conditions meant that it was much better to be a fisherman than a farmer. The burden of Jewish taxes lay most heavily on the rural agricultural population. The fisherman always had fish in the sea, but the farmer had to contend with bad crops.
Father Jerome Murphy O'Connor has studied the social climate of first century Galilee.
And even when things were going well, taxes were very high, between 40 and 65%. He was walking a very narrow margin because a small bit of land had to produce food for 3 groups, the owners, the animals, and seed for the following year. Then there had to be a surplus for births, deaths, and marriages. There had to be a surplus for plows and equipment. And there were famines roughly every 25 years, so that men on the land were inevitably forced off it. From free farmers, they became tenants. From tenants, they became landless men.
And in Judaism, land and the land you owned was of particular significance, wasn't it?
It was so precious to the people that God says that he owns the land, they are his tenants. They have no absolute control over the land. It was given to them for their use, to be passed on intact to the next generation.
The Lord said to Moses on Mount Sinai, "Say to the people of Israel, the land shall keep a Sabbath. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. The fields of common land belonging to their cities may not be sold. I am the Lord your God, who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan, and to be your God."
It's difficult to imagine in this peaceful setting how provocative the oppression had become.
This doesn't look the sort of landscape for revolutions.
Nonetheless, because of the tremendous burdens that rested on the shoulders of people for different reasons at different times, Herod was permitted to take 200 talents of silver out of Galilee. That's 10 tons of silver, well, over £1 million. Now that people crack under that sort of pressure periodically. And so there was a tremendous resentment building up at the time of the birth of Jesus. When Herod died, Galilee broke into revolt, and Varus tramped in with the legions from Syria and smashed everything, flattening the capital. That's what he did, destroying, burning the crops.
After the death of Herod, the whole country was prey to disorder, and ambitious individuals set out to make Judea was filled with brigandage. The Galileans, seizing this opportunity of venting their hatred on the cities they detested, rushed forward, intending to exterminate. Varus sent his troops across the country to capture those who had been involved in the sedition, and crucified 2,000 of the ringleaders.
In this atmosphere of revolution, revenge, and reprisals, Herod's son Antipas succeeded his father in Galilee. The cities Antipas began to build provided a new focus for his subjects' resentment. In the Roman remains of Bethshean, Professor Dick Horsley explains this spiral of violence in Galilee at the time of Jesus.
No sooner had the Romans destroyed the city of Sepphoris and enslaved the people inside and round about, but Antipas began rebuilding Sepphoris, and then he built a completely new city in Tiberias over on the lake, the Sea of Galilee. And when he built those, as a man who'd been raised in Rome and who had imbibed Roman culture, he decorated and built his own cities in a style befitting a Roman client ruler. So here would have been all around at the center of things, Roman culture that Antipas would have imported with his decorations on his palace, with colonnades in the streets, and with other trappings of Roman culture that would simply have said, "This is Rome, you folks better like it or lump it."
Yes, but in many countries, India for example, monuments were built to provide work. So surely there'd be many Galileans who were happy about the cities because they got work out of them.
Well, perhaps, but here was work that meant that you were building an alien culture. In these installations here, the amphitheater or the gymnasia, there would have been exercising in the nude, there would have been games with beasts, and such things would have been absolutely scandalous to Jewish culture. And of course, let's remember what funded the cities and what funded such entertainment would have been the economic exploitation of the indigenous population, which supported both the city and the other layer of taxation supporting the Roman troops that would have been based here.
So really you paint a picture of economic oppression of a people burdened by enormous taxation. Where does this picture then come out in the gospel stories?
One of our difficulties understanding these Gospels has been that we have tended to read it as religious literature. We've tended to spiritualize these stories. But the meaning of these words in the earliest layers is not that of spiritual life or that of religious life. Those words are very concrete and very economic. Cancel our debts in the Lord's Prayer. And Jesus telling parables about the importance of canceling each other's debts. And Jesus giving the Beatitudes saying, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry. Those are the people who are going to inherit the kingdom." So Jesus is speaking repeatedly and very concretely to the situation of the people, which is a desperate poverty.
Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Where does the Good Shepherd of the Catacombs fit into the society of rural Galilee?
Well, first of all, he was from a peasant village. That's about the best thing we know. Nazareth, I mean, you might guess maybe 200 people. It was very close, of course, to Sepphoris, so it's not that he is an isolated rural phenomenon that has never seen a city. He lives within 4 or 5 miles of a big Roman city, which he never mentions, by the way. I don't think he forgot about it. I don't think he liked it. And I think a lot of the peasants knew exactly what the city was. Of course, there were some benefits, but in terms of their way of life, it was dislocated. So I think that's the group that Jesus is especially working with, the line between the poor and the destitute.
But would you say which side of that line he was?
My suspicion is that he may have gone from poverty to destitution himself. And by that I mean from having your own subsistence farm and being able to keep your family to having lost the farm, or being pushed off it because there's too many children or something like that, and some of them have to go out into the big world off the farm.
But his father was apparently a carpenter, not a farmer.
The term that's used, tectone, for a carpenter is, in a peasant society, never presumes what we would think of it as a separate industry all by itself. That is a farmer who has a sideline business. An artisan in a peasant community is lower down on the pecking order than the peasant farmer. Peasant farmer, peasant artisan. If you're only a peasant artisan and have no land, you are down below the peasant farmer who has his own farm.
I find the picture of Jesus as a leader of the poorest of the poor very attractive. I've seen enough poverty in my life to know how oppressive it can be. And I've always felt that Christianity should be summed up in those words from the Magnificat, which I've heard so often at evensong. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich empty away. As I approached the tourist spa of Tiberias, one of the hated cities of the rich in the 1st century, I wondered why Jesus spent so much energy on healing when he was leading a revolution to raise the poor. There's an ancient tradition of healing in this area. For thousands of years, people have been coming to these hot springs of Tiberias to be cured. And at last, we're beginning to realize that healing is more complicated than we used to think. That there is a link between all those pressures on us, our relationships, our work, and our health. Of course, that was taken for granted in Jesus' time.
And he called the 12 together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. And he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal.
We have so many healing stories, we have to assume that Jesus was a healer. And certainly, we must understand this in the context, and he would have understood this in the context of the kingdom of God. Here's what he's pronouncing is that God is finally taking action for God's people, and then he himself must understand himself as the conduit of this energy, this healing energy that restores people's lives individually and collectively. And so in one healing after another, it would be manifesting the energies, God's energies, the divine energies, for the restoration of life and to make it whole individually and in that community.
As I see it, healers like Jesus cured the mind, the body, and the spirit. Healing was also a purification. It restored the sick to their friends, to their family, and to their community. But I still can't really understand what's so revolutionary about healing. Perhaps it wasn't so much the actual healing as the crowds of the poor and dispossessed it attracted.
Jesus at this stage in Galilee had moved from being a supporter of the law, as the disciple of John the Baptist, to being a critic of the law. And I think it came from his perception of the law, of the situation, where men forced off their land were obliged through necessity, they had families to feed, to become sinners in the technical Jewish sense, herdsmen, carters, anyone involved in the transport business, because theft was too easy. So that these were the sinners with whom he associated. And he recognized that even though the law classified them as opposed to God, they were victims of misfortune or an iniquitous tax system.
What was the significance of the meals which Jesus ate?
The significance of meals in the Middle East is very profound. It is the supreme gesture of hospitality to receive someone into your space to offer a meal. So when Jesus ate with sinners, that was a statement that he was accepting sinners as people who were worthy of association. Now, there would be no criticism if he ate with sinners in order to convert them, but there's no hint of that. He associated with sinners because he believed that they were victims who were loved by God.
Then he commanded them all to sit down by companies upon the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied.
Core historical question, it's almost so obvious that we forget it. Why did Jesus happen when he did, where he did, not some other time? And it's the dislocated peasantry, the peasantry who were being pushed off their lands, pushed from poverty into destitution, from subsistence into destitution. That's the group especially that the Jesus mission is directed to. And for them, healing and eating are the core problems.
Because they don't get enough to eat?
Because first of all, they don't get enough to eat. It's as basic as that. That's why the first thing the kingdom talks about, say in the Our Father, is enough bread for today. We won't even look for tomorrow. Just enough bread for today. That's what destitute people need.
And the healing?
The healing is, especially the itinerants whom Jesus sends out, he sends to the householders. Now, why do the householders particularly need healing? Because those are the people who are terrified of being pushed off their land from poverty, which is the normal condition of peasants. Poverty, I mean subsistence life. Pushed into destitution, losing their land. So it's a symbiosis, as it were, an interaction between the poor and the destitute. That's where Jesus is directing.
They said to him, Lord, let our eyes be opened. And Jesus, in pity, touched their eyes.
One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with them.
They brought to him a paralytic lying on his bed.
He even makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak.
Levi made him a great feast in his house.
And immediately they received their sight and followed.
And the dead man sat up and began to speak.
Rise.
And immediately the leprosy left him.
Take up your bed and go home.
And they all glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us.
It is poignant because we have these stories of the mass feedings. Now, if those go back to any incidents at all, anything in the ministry of Jesus, then they weren't exactly picnics. Think of where they're taking place. They're taking place in the wilderness. And what's the symbolic significance of the wilderness? Well, it's that desolate place where people go, where they're out of the eyes of the authorities, and where they can have a sense of their larger numbers involved in this movement of resistance and social revolution.
Did the rulers then, did Herod Antipas in particular, see Jesus as a threat?
We don't know for sure, but we have 2 indications in the Gospels that there was a good bit of conflict there. The tendency in the Gospel material would have been to weed out anything about Jesus and Antipas, because eventually it focused on events in Jerusalem. But these 2 cases are quite interesting. One is Antipas inquires of Jesus, and Jesus fires right back and calls Antipas that fox. Tell Antipas that fox that I will be about my program, and it's going to be finished promptly today, tomorrow, and the next day I'll be on my way to Jerusalem.
I'll finish you.
And that's right, I'll finish. And the other one is when John the Baptist's disciples come and ask Jesus, "Are you the coming one, the one that we should expect?" Jesus refers to all the things happening around the healings and the poor having good news preached to them. And then he asks rhetorically, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft raiment, a man living in a fancy palace. It's almost certain that that's a reference to Antipas, and in such caustic terms that it leaves no doubt about what Jesus thought about Antipas, mocking Antipas to the people upon whose backs Antipas had built his new city, his fancy palace, and lived in his soft raiment.
At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And he said to them, "Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I finish my course. Nevertheless, I must go on my way today and tomorrow and the day following. For it cannot be that a prophet should perish away from Jerusalem."
When Jesus came to Jerusalem, he confronted the corruption and conspicuous consumption of the rich. The evidence of the affluence of the upper-class Jews has been excavated by archaeologists and is now preserved in this museum. Here was a way of living and dying which Jesus would never have seen in rural Galilee. Yaakov Meshura of the Israel Museum showed me that the splendor of the rich was evident even in death.
Well, first of all, we find a lot of very luxurious tombs that they could afford cutting and hewing in the stone of hard limestone of Jerusalem to have what's so-called family tombs and so forth. And not everybody could afford it, but those rich people could buy a mountain or piece of a mountain and cut their own tombs and have it decorated, and inscriptions were shown, were cut on the rock to show
like
to
the
whom
inscription
it,
up there.
Up there, this
Yes.
belongs to
Yeah.
a famous family of priests, the so-called Chazir family. They were very rich, of course. They were in charge of collecting the money from Jews. You know, the people used to give the temple tribute money and other promises, gifts, and so forth. And a lot of money was accumulated in the temple, and it was a kind of, the central bank of the Jewish people. And they became very rich, and this is why also there was a lot of opposition, of course, against these people.
So when the Galileans went to the temple, would it be like sort of corruption, wouldn't they? There?
Yes, they would consider some of the deeds of the priests as corruption. For instance, I'm sure that they didn't like very much that they had to buy the tribute shekels from the priests, from the money changers, and pay 8% just for the changing of money. They brought their own money from the Galilee, and they had to pay it for with Tyrian shekels that they had to buy from the money changers in Jerusalem. This is why the money changers were so hated by people in Jerusalem.
Do you have one of those shekels too?
Sure. This is a Tyrian shekel. This is made of pure silver, and this was the only currency accepted at the temple as tribute money. And this is why, for instance, in the New Testament, Jesus says to Paulus, take this shekel and pay for yourself and for myself, because the tribute shekel was actually half a shekel, which means one whole shekel for two.
So and this shekel could be one of the shekels which fell to the ground when Jesus overturned the money changers.
It could be, it could be, yes.
entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons.
All these shops around, Dick, I can't help wondering, what do you think was Jesus' attitude to money?
You know, I can't imagine that Jesus or other folks who came from villages or small towns would have had much contact with money. It wasn't yet a monetarized society, as far as we know. On the other hand, money would have symbolized the large cities, where, of course, the coins were minted, and would have symbolized Roman power.
And Jesus was also accused of encouraging people not to pay their taxes, wasn't he?
Yes, indeed. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?
How do you interpret that famous saying?
In order to understand that saying, we have to understand how the people at the time would have understood that saying. And for those people, their only rightful king was God. The only rightful king to whom they owed things was God. So when Jesus answers, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, and unto God what's God's, there would have been no question in the minds of the people that nothing belongs to Caesar and everything belongs to God.
But surely, Dick, you can't have that. Jesus must have meant give something to Caesar, otherwise he wouldn't have said give something to Caesar.
We need to go back and notice that this is a trick question that the Pharisees and Herodians are asking Jesus. They know exactly where he's coming from, and they're hoping to entrap him with this question so that there's then a basis for arresting him, doing away with him. And Jesus is so subtle, so shrewd, that he can answer the question without saying anything culpable, but with having the populace understand exactly what he meant. And what he meant is based directly in that understanding of God as the true king, so that everything is owed to God and nothing to Caesar.
At his trial, Jesus was accused of stirring up the people. Now, do you think that was a false accusation or a true accusation?
Certainly it's been interpreted as a false accusation, but simply look at the Gospels. The Gospel writers themselves understand it as a true accusation. After all, what have they just portrayed? Jesus marched up into Jerusalem on a donkey, fulfilling Davidic prophecies of the Messiah. And then, of course, if we take that temple demonstration seriously, as I certainly do, there was a dramatic prophetic demonstration that was the closest thing to violence we come to in Jesus' activity, overthrowing the money changers' tables and with whips, driving people out. And just the things that he was saying against the temple and against the high priesthood, those would have been agitating comments. Of course, the people would have been stirred up.
Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium.
And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him to Pilate.
And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head.
And they stripped him.
And they struck his head with a reed and spat upon him.
And he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull.
Was Jesus crucified because he spoke out against the corruption in the temple? Was it because he stirred up the poor and the destitute? Was it because he constituted a threat to law and order in an occupied state? Was it because he was a revolutionary?
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of
He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place.
Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
Do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No,
Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied.
Woe to you that are full now, for you shall hunger.
I will destroy this temple that is made with hands.
I came to cast fire upon the earth, and would that it were already kindled.
Isn't Jesus the left-wing revolutionary, the patron of priests who've opted for the poor, a very modern picture? I'm sure it's right as far as it goes, but for me it leaves out Jesus, the spiritual teacher, Jesus, the emblem of God's love. These are the figures who, according to the Bible, inspired the early church and still inspire Christians today. After all, the Jesus of the Gospels did say, "Man shall not live by bread alone." And Jesus the revolutionary is only about daily bread. The real mystery to me is why the crucifixion wasn't the end of the story. After all, thousands of rebels were put to death in that blood-soaked century. Why did the movement which Jesus began survive the leader's death?
Well, the one thing that's important that I see before the death of Jesus is that the Jesus movement is an empowerment movement. It's a movement in which Jesus tells people to go do it yourselves. Don't just come to me. Go do it yourself. Go heal, go preach, bring the kingdom. Jesus in that situation is not the whole center of everything. Jesus can die and the movement can survive. And that is exactly what happened.
The movement survives because the followers go on healing.
Because the followers keep healing. Because there are people in Galilee who were doing it probably for maybe a month before they even found out Jesus was dead. And the kingdom didn't stop at 3 o'clock on that Friday afternoon. It still went on. They were still experiencing the power of God through Jesus, and Jesus was gone. So now somehow Jesus is still present, still empowering people.
What about those who say the followers lost their faith and only regained it because something truly remarkable called the resurrection? We don't know exactly what happened.
In a way, that's almost the way the story has been told in the last chapters of the gospel. I think the followers of Jesus lost their nerve, not their faith. They ran, and maybe that was a very good thing. We have a lot more dead first Christians. But it's a very different thing to lose your nerve and lose your faith. They didn't lose their faith. I think that would be a libel on the first Christians. They ran, but they stopped running, and they still believed that God had worked through Jesus.
All scholars agree on the importance of the resurrection. They disagree about what actually happened. There are good reasons for accepting a version nearer the Bible, and Ed Sanders is one scholar who does. What was the importance of the resurrection, Ed?
It's absolutely necessary for Christianity. It's the thing that made Christian faith happen. Indispensable.
Well, what happened then at the resurrection?
Now that's the difficult question. Let me start like this. Either the disciples had resurrection experiences or they made it all up. It's a hoax or fraud of some sort. Now, since some of these men were in the end going to give their lives for their belief, I think that the idea of a hoax or fraud is not likely. So I take it that something really happened. That is, they had resurrection experiences. But when it comes to describing what it was they saw, oh, that's really difficult. If you think of the passage in Luke where Jesus talks all afternoon with two disciples and they don't recognize him until he sits down with them and breaks bread. It seems clear from that sort of story that the Christians did not favor the view that Jesus, the risen Jesus, was a badly wounded man who was able to get up and stagger around for a bit, or a dead man who had been resuscitated, who had a short lease on life given back to him so that he could stagger around for a bit. No, on the contrary, he was not recognizable by people who knew him. And Paul comes up finally with the formula, spiritual body. Now, I do not know any more than anyone what a spiritual body was, but it was the best he could do.
And I've certainly never seen a spiritual body either.
That's right.
So you would say that nothing which could be described as miraculous happened after Jesus' death? Nothing really like the resurrection happened then?
Well, visions, of course. We know that Paul had a vision, and visions are at the start of every religious movement, so visions can be taken for granted, but visions are of what you most want or most desperately fear. They don't explain why you have that want or you have that love or you have that fear. That comes from the movement that was there before Jesus. So the resurrection for me means the continuation of that movement, that a docker at Corinth listening to Paul can experience the power of God through Jesus, and doesn't say, I believe you, Paul, but I believe God. I can experience this power, this empowerment. That's what the resurrection means for me. It's got nothing to do with a body coming out of the tomb. It's got nothing in itself to do with a vision. Those are what I would call parables of resurrection, but they're not the resurrection itself.
I can't say whether a body came out of a tomb. But I don't think a parable is good enough, nor is a modern explanation of visions. Surely the followers of Jesus believed they'd experienced an event. If they didn't, the church was founded by liars, and they aren't normally very inspiring. The blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. Those Christians gave their lives in the certain faith that they would be resurrected, a faith based on the evidence of the witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. Peter, one of the most important witnesses, was himself martyred right here in Rome. It's one of the greatest paradoxes of history that a marginal rebel on the edge of the Roman world should come to be believed in by the Roman world as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The secret of Christianity's success was that after the first few emperors, the Roman Empire began to flounder. Paganism, with its many manifestations of God, didn't provide the firm faith or moral guidance that men and women sought in those uncertain times. They turned to Christianity with its belief in one God and its strict morality.
For we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand.
3 centuries after Jesus was put to death as a criminal subversive, the Emperor Constantine accepted the Christian faith himself. Ravenna on the east coast of Italy was for a time the capital of the empire. Its many churches show us Christianity as it became under imperial patronage. Confident, wealthy, powerful, and prestigious. In the glittering mosaics, Jesus wears the imperial purple, very different to the simple tunic of the Good Shepherd of the catacombs. Does this splendor show that the rebel joined the ruling class? Is the man who challenged Rome now on the side of the emperor? Was it a complete sellout?
The emperor is there clothed in purple. He has a halo around his head. But notice 2 things. He is carrying a gift, and the gift is rather large and gold, and he's taking it towards Jesus. And also notice, by the way, he's standing up. Now, when you turn from the lower register where the emperor is to a much higher register, you find Jesus seated, notice he's seated, on the world. On either side of him are 2 angels, and the only people up there with him besides the angels are a martyr and the bishop. There are no imperial courtiers up there. And Jesus, seated on the world, still wears sandals just like the sandals that he would have worn long ago when it all began.
And he's way above the emperor there, isn't he?
He is way above the emperor.
I like this warrior Jesus in the chapel of the Archbishop of Ravenna. I suppose I shouldn't really, bearing in mind all the religious wars that Christians have been involved in and still are. But just look at this picture. There's the warrior Jesus standing on a serpent. Well, that's understandable. The serpent is, after all, the symbol of temptation. But with the other foot, he's trampling on the lion, and that's the symbol of the empire of imperial authority. And I like to be reminded that although the Church has often seemed to surrender totally to the powers of this world, it's never quite forgotten that it started as a revolt.
Jesus the rebel was a man of action. But there is a more profoundly spiritual Jesus too, and it's in the desert, away from politics and empire, that we can find him. "300 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, there were perhaps 500,000 Christian hermits who'd chosen to live lives of extreme poverty here in the desert. They believed that by selling everything and fleeing from civilization, they were following the example and teaching of Jesus. But was this the way Jesus lived? Did he really want people to hide from civilization? In the silence of the desert, Muhammad, Moses, and Jesus all came face to face with God. Those who want to find stillness and quiet, rare commodities today, undergo the hardship of the desert, though nowadays on holiday. This group have come here to Egypt to visit the holy places of the Old Testament. I've come here to find the Jesus hidden for well over 1,000 years, the Jesus who is now coming to light.
We've all arrived here in the middle of the desert, so I just want to talk to you a little bit about what to expect and about how to stay well and healthy while we travel with the Bedouin. There is really only one danger here in the desert, one major danger, and that is the heat. And the biggest danger that comes with the heat is dehydration. So it is very important to drink little and often, but it is very easy in the excitement of the desert and seeing different things and living a different way to forget.
I've been to all sorts of lonely, wild places, and I love the scenery. I like to get away. I like the feeling of silence and being in a strange and wild country, really.
I do find the scenery fascinating and awe-inspiring. I always think it's the right place to meet God.
It was then a place of beginnings, and it's a place of beginnings all the time, and that, I think, is why Jesus went to the desert, as a place of beginnings where he could think things out from first principles. And it's also a place where, for example, the Dead Sea Scroll people went because they were fed up with the Jerusalem establishment. So they said, well, we'll go off to the Qumran and start again. So it's a place of new starts, of completely starting all over. And I think that's one of the important secrets of it. Some people say that God made the world and this is the place where he didn't quite finish. And that, I think, is also another, makes it amazingly interesting. It's that kind of dramatic thing which I think makes people naturally think of theological dimensions.
For 3 centuries, Christianity demanded courage. Christians were despised, persecuted, and martyred. But at the beginning of the 4th century, there was a reversal of fortune. Christianity became respectable. Martyrdom was no longer the highway to salvation. So Christians, seeking perfection, took the harsh road of loneliness and poverty in the desert.
A man came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus said, "You shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. Honor your father and your mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The young man said to him, "All these have I observed. What do I lack?" Jesus said, "If you will be perfect, go, sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me."
Instead of confrontation with the Roman Empire, the Christian hermits drew up new battle lines. The conflict was now a spiritual one, a confrontation with nature and personal demons. These desert fathers embarked on an ascetic struggle, sacrificing everything in the name of Jesus. They believed that was the way Jesus had lived, that he too had been an ascetic. Egypt, with its fertile Nile Valley, was a leading center of trade and culture at the time of Jesus. The faith of the pharaohs still survived. Greek and Roman philosophy had arrived too, and so had Judaism. They influenced each other, making Egypt a cauldron in which ideas bubbled up and spilled over into neighboring regions. According to one of the Gospels, Jesus himself was brought here to escape the wrath of Herod. New evidence has been found in this ancient land which suggests that Jesus' teaching was not just based on his Jewish religion, that he could have been influenced by pagan faiths and philosophies too. Recent discoveries are now revealing clues to a Jesus different from the Church's picture of its founder. This Jesus was opposed to institutions. He would have been an opponent of the Church too. He called on his followers to seek their own salvation. He was a teacher of wisdom rather than a Messiah. The late 20th century doesn't seem to respond to the Jesus of the Church, but the search for timeless wisdom does go on. Charismatic preachers, gurus, and God-men all flourish. We feel that the ancients had a knowledge of the purpose of life that we've lost. We do want a God who can fulfill our deepest spiritual needs. Christianity arrived in Egypt very early. The fledgling church wasn't the powerful institution it was to become. There were no grand buildings, no fixed dogma, no set rules, not even agreement on the contents of the New Testament. In the ferment of magic and mystery, faith and philosophy, there were deep divisions among Christians. Elaine Pagels is an early church historian who has studied the new evidence from Egypt.
There seems to have been conflict between Christian groups. There were those particularly who thought of Jesus primarily as Lord and Savior, the one on whom one must believe to be saved, Jesus whose death saves us from sin, who rose from the dead and so forth for our salvation, that view of Jesus. And others who tended to think of Jesus more as an enlightened being, one who pointed the way toward the discovery of the divine within oneself.
Who won out in this conflict then?
Well, we all know that the institutional church, with its insistence on orthodox teachings about Jesus, not only suppressed but attacked and pretty much annihilated memory of those whom they called heretics. I mean, the word heresy means those who made choices, and making choices was seen as a rebellious act against the institution that would become the church.
I wondered whether I'd find what those heretics believed about Jesus by following the route of the Desert Fathers into solitude and separation. The best known was St. Anthony. His biography, written by the Egyptian Bishop Athanasius, was a 4th century bestseller. It caused a sensation throughout the empire, with copies reaching as far as France. The life of Antony converted many pagans and launched the monastic movement. Christians, disillusioned with the church growing ever more rich and powerful, responded to St. Anthony's asceticism, extreme though it must have seemed even in his own age. Athanasius wrote of him, He was always fasting, and he had clothing with hair on the interior and skin on the exterior that he wore until he died. He neither bathed his body with water for cleanliness, nor did he ever wash his feet. After a long, hot journey, I've almost reached the world's first Christian monastery. It was founded by St. Anthony himself. He withdrew into the desert to protest not just against the world, but also against the church of his time. He felt that under imperial patronage, the church was becoming too fond of the good things of life. He told Christians they could not use the teaching of Jesus to justify worldliness. If they wanted to follow Jesus, they had to renounce the world and rejoice in poverty, not wealth.
Jesus said, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is easy and the way is wide that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few."
These desert monks believe they've gone through the narrow gate to follow the Jesus of the few, separated from the temptations of the world, the flesh, and the devil. They belong to the Egyptian or Coptic church, and they regard themselves as disciples of St. Anthony. These monks live very simple lives, centered entirely on work and prayer. It didn't take long for the church to order hermits to live in monasteries, hoping in this way to control their spiritual exuberance. But there was a conflict between the hermit's search for an individual Jesus and life in a monastic institution. After all, Jesus went into the desert on his own. He called his disciples one by one and taught each of his followers to call on God as his own Father. Although these monks live in a community, they try to imitate St. Anthony the Hermit as closely as possible. Like him, they follow Jesus' instruction to give up everything. Most of them could have pursued wealth and success in the world outside. Father Discorus was set on a career as an accountant.
We received the tradition from the oldest father, and the father received the tradition from the oldest and oldest.
And you feel they are still very close to you, although
Sure, they are buried in the cemetery in the monastery. From time to time, we went to visit them, and also to celebrate and remember them in our prayers. And we believe they are also pray for us in the heaven. We are in contact with them. Even they are far from us, but the Spirit with us.
Today's monks see themselves in a long line stretching back to St. Anthony. His vision is their vision of Jesus, an ascetic who inspired individuals to heroic self-sacrifice.
St. Anthony is the first one who started to translate the teaching of the gospel to a practical life.
Do you believe that Jesus led a life of giving up everything, that Jesus was an ascetic?
Oh, yes. The first example for us, not as St. Anthony, Jesus Christ, I mean for the monastic life, if you see the life of the monks here in the monastery, it's the same the life of Christ when he is on the earth. I mean, he was poor, like monks. He was living alone, but just he was serving people, I mean teaching people, like the monks till now. He was not interested in food and dresses and the modern thing, no. Just he is living for the people. We can say that the monastic life, it's not new life, but just we are trying to live like Jesus Christ.
The monks have fled the world, but the world pursues them. Egyptian Christians travel miles to this remote monastery to seek their counsel and blessing. This is an old tradition. The curious and the troubled sought out Antony and the other desert fathers, hoping for words of wisdom.
Abba Moses, I have traveled from Sketis to find you in this wilderness. Give me a word from God that I may live.
My son, go and sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. Be at peace with your soul, and heaven and earth will be at peace with you. The ladder of the kingdom is hidden within you, within your soul.
The words of the Desert Fathers have reminded me how often Jesus taught in riddles and stories. He seems to have thought we should find answers for ourselves rather than trust the religious authority of others. He himself went into the desert of Judea alone to confront what for him was the great question, how to use his power.
Jesus was led by the Spirit for 40 days in the wilderness, tempted, and when they were ended, he was hungry.
And the tempter
The devil said to him,
If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves. The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. And he said to him, all these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me.
He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered to him.
The Gospel of Mark says that as soon as the Holy Spirit descended on Jesus at baptism, the Spirit drove him into the wilderness to be tempted by the Satan. And there it speaks of temptations which Jesus rejected, of power, political power, of sensual gratification, and so forth.
Are you saying that Jesus was an ascetic? Because after all, in the Gospels, he was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard.
Yes, it seems from the Gospels that he was not ascetic in terms of what he ate and drank, and certainly not scrupulous in terms of the food laws, as his opponents accused him of being very lax. But in regard to the greatest, enormous religious obligations of the Jewish community, which would be obligations to parents, to marriage, to children, those apparently he rejected. It was rather anomalous, as you know, for a rabbi to be unmarried and apparently celibate. And that, in that sense, Jesus seems to have renounced ordinary expectations, renounced the world of family and economic life.
In first century Palestine, Jesus was an outsider, both in the way he lived and in his challenge to the establishment.
Jesus said, I have come to set a man against his father and a daughter against her mother.
To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God.
Lord, let me first go and bury my father. Jesus said to him, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of. Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead.
Jesus' voice wasn't the only voice of dissent. The wealth and corruption of the temple in Jerusalem scandalized many Jews. Some even withdrew to the desert to live an ascetic life, which they believed was the Jewish tradition. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at Qumran, scholars thought they'd found the source of Jesus' asceticism. But as the scrolls were translated, it became clear that there were important differences between the Essenes, the Dead Sea community, and Jesus. The Essenes lived a settled life. Jesus wandered from place to place. They had a very strict code of conduct. Jesus was remarkably relaxed about rules. They didn't laugh. Jesus did. Perhaps Jesus got his ideas from an even stranger source. In his time, there were wandering teachers called cynics, who lived by the precepts of the Greek philosopher Diogenes. I remember learning about him as a schoolboy. He was the man who was famous for living in a barrel. The cynics believed the simpler the life, the happier it would be. Jesus said, "Take no thought for the morrow." So did the cynics. Jesus taught, "Consider the birds, they neither sow nor reap." The cynics suggested learning from the larks and the blackbirds. When Jesus sent out his disciples to preach, he told them to travel light.
These 12 Jesus sent out, charging them, "You receive without paying, give without pay. Take no gold, nor silver, nor copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves."
Jesus' instructions would have looked like a particularly severe version of cynicism, because they're not even allowed a staff to go with them. It's not a cloak, it's only a simple tunic that they're wearing, and they mustn't take a begging bag. But to go around like that, really sort of defenseless and ill-clad, would, certainly in many settings in the ancient world, have made them look like cynics.
Gerald Downing has looked at where cynic ideas might be found in Jesus' teaching.
In the insistence on poverty, on doing without riches, in the rude remarks he makes about people in authority, the so-called benefactors, the mannequins in the palaces, that kind of thing. In his wandering around, nowhere to lay his head, like the worse off than the foxes and the birds. On one occasion he's recorded as saying that the dead bury their dead. A very shocking thing to say in terms of Jewish tradition. There's one particular piece of Jesus' teaching, well known to many people. Consider the ravens or the crows. Consider the lilies or the anemones. There's nothing in Jewish tradition that encourages anybody to copy careless crows or improvident anemones. But we find this as a repeated theme in cynicism, that you act as the animals do without making provision for tomorrow. Very risky and very uncomfortable for any of us who claim to be Jesus followers today. But that's what he says. And that's very clearly what cynics say.
Although I'm unfamiliar with Coptic worship, I recognize what's going on. It's the sacrifice of the Mass, the Jesus who died for us and rose again and is now present in the bread and the wine. It's certainly not the cynic Jesus. I think he would have been suspicious of all this ritual. Did the church hide evidence of the cynic Jesus? Did the church write its own version of the life of Jesus, leaving out anything it disapproved of? Athanasius, the most powerful bishop in Egypt, certainly seems to have rewritten the history of St. Anthony. He portrayed the eccentric hermit as a valiant defender of Orthodox faith, a tradition which has passed down to the Coptic monks of today. But if you read between the lines, you find that St. Anthony was suspicious of bishops and was not too scrupulous about taking communion.
We have different traditions of Anthony, just as we do of Jesus. And you look at some of the sayings of Anthony and the other fathers, they sound quite radically individualistic as spiritual pioneers. But when you read Athanasius' version, Anthony becomes the champion of orthodoxy. He passes on literally his mantle to the bishop. He becomes the great Orthodox monk, the model which Athanasius wanted all monks to follow. And his followers to this day do that.
So you would describe that as a doctored version of Anthony's life, would you?
Perhaps that's the wrong, an impolitic word to choose. But many scholars have recently noticed how Athanasius shaped the image, if you like, of Anthony to turn him into the model Orthodox monk. Model by the bishop standards, that is, of course.
Perhaps the bishop shaped the image of Jesus too. We've known for a long time that there are sayings ascribed to Jesus that do not appear in the four Gospels approved by the Church. In the 19th century in Egypt, we first found fragments of those sayings.
Lift up the stone when you know yourselves. Split a piece of wood, I am. Fortunate are those who are alone children of the living Father, for you will find the kingdom.
The structures of early Egyptian Christianity collapsed. The manuscripts disappeared. So for centuries, we didn't understand how widespread the influence of the alternative sayings was. We only knew about the people who lived by these sayings from the writings of their enemies, the early church fathers. Then, in 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi, a remarkable library of Christian writings was discovered by chance. They were identified as being written by the Gnostics, Christians who believed they possessed secret knowledge imparted to them by Jesus himself. The writings depicted a Jesus in conflict with much of the teachings of the Orthodox Church. Marvin Mayer has translated some of the manuscripts.
Well, as far as we can tell, this is the spot where the Nag Hammadi library was discovered. It seems, as far as we reconstruct that story, that there were some camel drivers who hobbled their camels down below and walked up here, digging for fertilizer, and found the jar within which the Nag Hammadi library was discovered. Now, this library is such a significant library for us because of the fact that we feel very likely that this library might have been a part of the library of the monks that lived in monasteries in this area. And if that is the case, then it becomes very interesting as a moment in the discussion of orthodoxy and heresy during that time period. As we put things together, it seems quite likely that monks may have buried those texts here because these were suppressed texts. These were texts that Orthodox Christians were trying to get rid of, were trying to remove from the eyes of the faithful, and so the monks might have put those texts here to be safely stored away from their eyes. These texts are indeed remarkable texts. They contain many documents that are not found in the New Testament and yet are very important for our understanding of Jesus and the early church.
Among the discoveries were several new Gospels, one apparently by Mary Magdalene, one by the Apostle Philip, and the best preserved, a Gospel from St. Thomas the Doubter. The bishops condemned those who believed in these texts as heretics, but we now know the monks who preserved them did not regard themselves as outside the church.
If you'll notice, Mark, you see that on the wall there are examples of the opening lines of the Psalms. in Coptic, and it must be that the Coptic monks use these opening lines for their meditation to remind them, really, of how the Psalms begin, so they could recite that in their practices.
Sort of gave them a kick start.
Absolutely, yes, yes.
A bit like we used to have in prayer books, where you had a couple of Latin lines about the Psalms.
Very much like that.
Exactly.
Yes.
Oh.
The leaders of the church apparently found it quite threatening that there were members of Christian communities who were going off on their own, often into the desert, often by themselves, on a solitary individualistic quest for spiritual discovery. And sometimes they were coming up with things that, say, the bishop didn't like. So that kind of spiritual exploration could be quite threatening to a bishop who is trying to unify the church community and gather that community under his authority.
We know that the church opposed the Gnostics because we have the writings of the early fathers. Do we know what the Gnostics' actual attitude to the church was? Were they enemies of the church? Were they opposed to the church?
It's a good question. The earliest sources suggest, as I said, that the writings, say, of the Gospel of Thomas was simply the supplementary, the more advanced teaching. But later, as people who loved these teachings were rejected by the church, they took on an antagonistic view. For example, I think if you were the leader of a small church that is struggling to survive against the enormous pressures of Roman persecution, there are some things you might prefer that Jesus not have said, if indeed he said them. For example, the saying from the Gospel of Thomas, number 70, in which Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." Now that suggests you don't need a ritual, a priest, a church. You may not even need Jesus. You need to discover the resources of the divine, which are hidden deep within the human.
The Coptic Church did not welcome the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library. The manuscripts were recognized as a challenge to Orthodox Christianity. Even after 50 years, they have not been published in Egypt. They're kept under lock and key in the Coptic Museum.
This is the Gospel of Thomas. These actually are two sheets from Book 2 or Codex 2 of the Nag Hammadi Library, and on the sheets are several pages that come from the Gospel of Thomas. You see here, Mark, is the last page of the Gospel of Thomas where the title is given, Puangelion Pakata Tahomas, the Gospel according to Thomas. That title is given at the end of the text, and there is another kind of a title, an earlier title given at the beginning of the text. These are the hidden sayings of the living Jesus. And this is the very remarkable text that may tell us a great deal about the historical Jesus and what his significance was in the early church.
These are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Judas Thomas the twin recorded. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings shall not taste death. When you know yourselves, you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. Fortunate are those who are alone and chosen, for you will find the kingdom. For you have come from it, and you will return there again. Jesus said, I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all has come forth, and to me all has reached. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there.
But what we see in the Gospel of Thomas is a particular kind of literature. It's a sayings text. We call it a sayings gospel. That is to say, it is a gospel that has sayings of Jesus without any particular narrative context. Typically in the New Testament Gospels, what we have is a Jesus who is setting his eyes toward Jerusalem, who is on the way to the cross. Not so in the Gospel of Thomas. In fact, there is only one reference in the Gospel of Thomas to the cross, and that is in the context of a proverb, that you have to bear your cross, that you have to bear your burden. That's the only reference to the cross. There's no reference to the resurrection whatsoever. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus seems to function as a homeless kind of wanderer who is wandering with a few men and women around him, asking provocative questions about God's reign and God's rule, not defining it, but telling stories about it, stories that are sufficiently open to allow those around Jesus to try to find God in everyday life around them. That may be, in fact, rather close to the historical Jesus in many ways of thinking about him, and that portrait thus in the Gospel of Thomas may prove to be a very significant one for us as we try to think of who Jesus as an historical person might have been.
This Jesus has great appeal for me. He's rather like an Indian guru. He doesn't ram dogma down my throat. He encourages me to find God for myself. I don't think he'd even ask me to belong to a particular church or recite a specific creed. I think he may well be the Jesus of the next millennium. The Jesus of the Gospel of Thomas was so provocative that the early church tried to suppress him. But I wonder whether Jesus would have survived at all if the church hadn't been there to preserve his memory. This ancient monastery of St. Catherine in the desert below Mount Sinai stands as a symbol of the church, the fortress protecting the Christian faith from its enemies. The Greek Orthodox monks have protected and preserved some of the most precious New Testament manuscripts. But some would argue that the church has protected Jesus by locking him up in a gilded cage. Has the church destroyed the Jesus who teases us with riddles and put in place a remote, distant God? A God whose light doesn't guide us to wisdom, but blinds us with fear? A Jesus risen on high rather than the Jesus reborn in our hearts? It became a test of orthodoxy to accept a literal view of the resurrection.
It seems that within the New Testament, Christians could sustain the ambiguity and say, well, it happened this way, maybe it happened this way. What we know for sure is that the one who died is somehow alive. By the 2nd century, some of the fathers of the church said, if you don't believe that the body got out of the grave in 3 days, you're not on our side. And what struck me when I was curious about that is that it seemed to be important to establish who was really connected with Jesus. That is, if you had seen him out of the grave, and he was only available in that form for 40 days, according to Luke, then you were truly a member of the initiated elite of the church. And ever since the beginning, to the days of the present popes, the leaders of the church have claimed that their authority derives from Peter, the first witness of the resurrection.
So the resurrection, in a way, was crucial to the authority of the church.
Indeed, if you look at the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for example, one of the Gnostic texts that was found, Peter asked her, well, where did you get these things? And she said, well, I saw the Lord in a dream last night, and he said to me, and he stops her and says, what do you mean you saw him in a dream? Because if you could see the Lord in a vision, you could see him today. People do, of course. And what you see could surpass the revelation of the church. And that is enormously threatening. Then you have any possibility of any wild-eyed, prophet out of the desert coming with a new revelation from Jesus.
The resurrection is the most important, yet the most difficult teaching of the church. The monks of St. Catherine's are so confident they will rise again that they live with a stark reminder of death. The skulls of their predecessors stored in the monastery charnel house. But for most of us, belief in the resurrection does present great difficulties. It has done since the very earliest days of Christianity, as St. John tells us in his Gospel.
Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of the nails, and place my hand in his side, I will not believe." Jesus came and stood among them, and said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God."
I find it fascinating that on the one hand, St. Thomas's Gospel does not appear to mention the resurrection and doesn't appear to take the resurrection very seriously. And yet in St. John's Gospel, we have this story of Thomas being one of the very few people who literally touched the resurrected Jesus.
Yes, actually, new research suggests that the Thomas tradition was that Jesus was alive after he died in some form that is incomprehensible and never stated. But that the Gospel of John, which depicts Thomas as the great doubter, you know, the one who's got to be convinced by physical touch, that is a polemic against the Thomas Christians who maintained a different and perhaps more mysterious view of resurrection.
So it was a story added by John, really, in a way, to discredit Thomas in some ways?
Today, many scholars are suggesting that the Gospel of John is intended to attack this Thomas perception of Jesus and his resurrection.
Now, the four Gospels which got into the New Testament, which were accepted by the Church as the New Testament, do they in some way reflect the Church's concern about authority?
The question was certainly one of authority, but it would be wrong, I think, to think of this as some Machiavellian power ploy on the part of the bishops to consolidate their power. Actually, to be a bishop in the 2nd century meant that one was a target of persecution. And the Romans, I mean, often the first one to be arrested, tortured, and executed would be the bishop. The bishops were actually trying to ensure the survival of a very fragile movement.
Christianity has survived through the Church at a price.
Yes.
What has been lost, do you think?
Before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text, you would think that all that had been lost was nonsense and gibberish and blasphemous garbage. But now we realize that these are in fact mystical traditions. They're traditions about internal contemplation. I think they're spiritually powerful and profound in many ways, where it's not a question of believing in Jesus simply, but finally becoming Jesus.
The pilgrims have now spent several days in the desert, the place where so many before them felt they'd met God. Some of them are finding a more direct experience of God than they found at home.
I think the whole thing becomes prayer. It's not a matter of words and particular times, but being aware of God's presence, which again you can do at home very easily, but it comes more easily here.
There are absolutely no distractions. It's just you and your thoughts and the vastness of this incredible creation.
The asceticism of these pilgrims doesn't match St. Anthony's, judging by their dinner. But I'm reminded that Jesus liked a good meal too.
There we go, that looks absolutely terrific.
No comparison there compared to butter. I'm not sure whether it's a place to be in touch with God. I think it's more a place where you're in touch with yourself. And then whether you feel the need to think about God, or whether you sort of become more at peace with yourself. That's a personal thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I couldn't leave the desert without ascending Mount Sinai, where God gave the 10 Commandments and the prophet Elijah heard the still small voice. At all times and in all places, people have worshipped God. It's only in the brief history of the secular West that religion has become a minority interest. I began this journey trying to find out whether the claim that Jesus was human and divine would survive yet another millennium. I started in India, where I learnt from the parallels between Hinduism and Christianity that we all worship the same God. But that undermines the Christian claim that Jesus is the only way, the only Son of God. In Israel, that claim was also challenged by scholars I met, who suggested that Jesus might have been quite an ordinary person, just another Jewish preacher perhaps, or maybe a minor irritant to the Roman Empire. Now here in Sinai, I find historical evidence of the extraordinary influence Jesus can exercise. That is a fact, whether Jesus is divine or not. The Desert Fathers teach me that the countless Christians who have lived heroic lives have done so because they have let Jesus live in them. Moses met God on this mountaintop, and the climb to get up here symbolizes the ascetic struggle and the mountains we have to ascend if we're to find Jesus for ourselves and not just accept the Church's teaching. But there's a danger in this spiritual search. All the scholars I've spoken to have warned against creating Jesus in our own image, a Jesus who is not rooted in history. I was once a firm believer in Jesus and wanted to be a priest in the Church of England, but I found I was more at home in the pub than the pulpit.
Thanks very much, Chef.
Working as a journalist, my faith ebbed away. I was afraid that this journey would finally end Christianity for me. But back where I still feel at home, I find I'm once again fascinated by the figure of Jesus. I've been reminded that whatever happened during his lifetime, after death he became the man accepted by almost all as the most important figure of the last 2,000 years. But that man was probably a failure in his own lifetime. That's what I've learned from the historians. He didn't prophesy correctly. He taught in strange riddles. He didn't convince his fellow Jews, and he didn't overthrow Rome. From that failure, I've come to what for me is the most important conclusion of all, that the hardest, apparently least historical article of Christian faith, the resurrection, must have happened. If there'd been no miracle after Jesus' death, there would have been no grounds for faith in a failed life. No resurrection, no church. What exactly happened, we may never know. But I now believe that if Jesus' companions were prepared to die for their faith in the resurrection, there's no historical reason why we shouldn't live in that faith.